U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has previously suggested that he could end the war in Ukraine within a day, indicating a potential shift towards diplomacy over military intervention. As casualty mounts on both sides, Trump's anticipated peace efforts raise questions about the balance of power and potential shifts in U.S. support. Joining us on TVP World to discuss the implications of Trump's proposed approach is Peter Dickinson, chief editor of Business Ukraine magazine. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good evening.
Good evening. So now, Donald Trump actually claimed that he could resolve the Ukraine conflict within a day. Of course, hyperbole aside, definitely he's perhaps oversimplifying the issue. What are some of the hurdles that you imagine he'll come across while trying to resolve said issue?
Well, based on Trump's public statements and his known policies during his first term, it seems clear that Trump's goal will be to end the war through negotiations, or to, so to speak, to strike a deal of some kind with Putin that would allow him to end the war. Whereas his predecessor, Joe Biden, often talked about preventing Russia from winning or even supporting Ukrainian victory. Trump's emphasis is very much simply on ending the war. So the real challenge will be to find a balance that can somehow satisfy both Russia and Ukraine and allow that deal to be made. Now, the signals coming out of Russia is that there's no room for compromise. There's no room to water down the demands that Russia has, which are very substantial demands, territorial demands on Ukraine. Also demands for Ukraine for Ukraine to cede around 20% of its lands to Russia, to accept neutrality, to voluntarily step back from any international military alliances, and to essentially allow Russia to have a very significant influence, if not control, over Ukrainian domestic policy. So Ukrainians have said all along that is not acceptable. Russia doesn't want to budge. From Ukraine's side, we also see a very tough negotiating position, because Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky has said he will not countenance any ceding of Ukrainian land in exchange for peace. So Trump is setting out his stall as a negotiator. He wants to negotiate a peace, but it's really not clear what the potential terms of that peace could be.
Right, and with both Russia and Ukraine enduring heavy losses, of course, also with recent reports of Russians suffering 80,000 in losses just in October alone, which side do you think actually holds a stronger position entering a potential peace negotiation?
Well, you're quite right to highlight that losses are on both sides. We hear a lot in the Western media about Russian losses. Of course, in the Russian media, they're hearing about Ukrainian losses. I think the truth is that both sides are suffering from very heavy casualty rates. As Russia is currently on the offensive, is attacking, it's reasonable to assume that Russia is now suffering the worst of the losses, because that is the nature of modern conflict, that the defensive force is in a much better position to inflict those kind of losses. But then the question arises, does Putin really care? Is this putting pressure on him domestically? There's very little sign of that. Putin has been very careful to select soldiers who are either volunteers, being paid very, very well by Russian standards, it should be noted. They're being paid tens of thousands of dollars just to sign up for the army now. And then once in the army, they're receiving salaries that are perhaps 5 times above the average Russian national wage. So these are really well-paid volunteers. And there's no real indication that Russia is going to struggle to maintain the flow of these soldiers, however heavy the losses are. Many volunteer knowing that they might not return, but knowing that their families will be secured and will be looked after, for example. So whilst Russia is suffering very, very significant losses that most countries would not even be able to basically countenance, I don't think it's a major factor for Putin, certainly not decisive. Ukraine, on the other hand, has far fewer people to begin with. The population of Ukraine is around 1/4 of the population of Russia. Ukraine is now maintaining a much larger army proportionally. So I think that if we're talking about a war of attrition, in the current circumstances, as we're seeing the current format of the war, Russia holds the advantages unquestionably.
And like you mentioned earlier, it is very unlikely that Ukrainian President Zelensky will be willing to cede any ground in terms of negotiation of ceding land. There's a recent report from the BBC quoting a former advisor of Trump, Brian Lenza, saying that they had to gauge Zelensky's response, whether he's serious about this peace negotiation or not, citing Crimea as the prime example of if Zelensky not being willing to cede Crimea, that means he is not serious. Now, even though, of course, this has been reviewed by the Trump administration and they have been distancing from the statement, what's your thoughts on this quote saying that perhaps Ukraine is a little bit too optimistic when thinking about maintaining all its land territory?
Well, I think it was a very interesting quote because, as you say, the quote came out, it was widely publicized, and then the Trump administration actually came out and said, no, this person does not speak for us, and sought to put some distance between themselves and the speaker. That was something that many people here in Kiev, for example, were very encouraged by that. I would be cautious. I think that those comments that he mentioned are a fair reflection, probably, of the kind of discussions that are taking place within the Trump camp, within many of Trump's allies, Trump supporters, perhaps Trump himself. So I think we should be realistic here that the expectation, based on these recent comments, but also on previous comments from supporters of Trump, from Trump's own vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance, from the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, they've all indicated that Trump's vision for a deal does involve Ukraine ceding lands. Now, there's different ways of doing that, of course, and I think what we might get into would be a discussion about the format here in terms of recognition that no Ukrainian president, be it Zelensky, be it another figure, I think could realistically accept the loss of 20% of their country. But we could see a scenario where they accepted a de facto occupation by Russia, for example, for an extended period, accepted the current front lines as a de facto border, whilst recognizing that internationally these territories remained and will remain part of Ukraine, will remain part of Ukraine's sovereign territory. So there's different ways of phrasing it, but I think there's certainly an expectation within the Trump team that some sort of a territorial concession must be made. And I think people in Ukraine also, to a greater or lesser degree, are ready to recognize this. But then the key question would be what form of security guarantees Ukraine could have. If Ukraine was to come out of this war with part of their territory occupied by Russia, but with very, very serious security guarantees of a NATO level, let's say, perhaps not NATO membership, but of the same level as NATO, then that would be an outcome that I think many in Ukraine would be able to accept. If they come out of the war with 20% of their country occupied and no guarantees, and they're essentially left in no man's land as a neutral country, basically at Russia's mercy, that would be seen as a disaster. So a lot will depend on the terms, the details here, and specifically the security guarantees that may be put in place.
Right, like I mentioned, terms and detail, there are still a lot of nuances rather than just ceding land. Now, when it comes to Trump's position or the new administration's position, there's been talk previously about the possibility of Mike Pompeo, one of the more hawkish figures in support of Ukraine, being within his cabinet. But that has since seemingly been taken off the table. Do you think that is another sign that perhaps Trump will be pursuing a more negotiation tactic than just military support for Ukraine?
Yes, certainly. Pompeo was seen as perhaps the ideal candidate for Ukraine. The idea that he was even in discussion was something that many people in Kiev saw as a very positive sign that the Trump presidency would not necessarily be bad news for Ukraine. I think now that Trump has come out and said, no, I'm ruling it out, again, is a signal that people in Ukraine should not be overly optimistic. They should be realists here, and they should expect a very, if not pro-Kremlin, then a very sort of Russia-sympathetic White House under President Trump that is not looking to engage in a prolonged conflict with Moscow and is looking for not only to end the war in Ukraine, but is looking to rebuild some form of of constructive relationship with Russia, perhaps also. So, yes, certainly that was a very strong signal that was not in Ukraine's favor, that indicates that Trump is looking to go a different route, and he certainly doesn't want to bring in these sort of establishment figures who served in his first term, like Pompeo.
And you also mentioned earlier that perhaps there is no room for negotiation when it comes to Russia compromising. But Russia has also recently showed a little bit of interest in Trump's peace proposals. Could this signal military strain, or do you think it's more of a strategy to sway U.S. foreign policy?
Well, it could show strain. I mean, there are signs of strain in Russia. The Russian economy is showing signs of strain. Russia, although I say they have a very large manpower base to draw from, you know, they have recently brought in 10,000 soldiers from North Korea, which doesn't suggest they have unlimited resources, or it certainly indicates they don't want to mobilize forcefully their population if they can avoid it. So there are strains on display in Russia. Russia does not have limitless supplies of money or men. Public opinion does exist in Russia, although it's suppressed. So certainly Putin, if he were offered an attractive way out, may be tempted to take it. But I don't think there's any urgency in Russia. Russia is winning the war at the moment. They're gaining ground. They're moving forward. Internationally, things are going in Russia's favor. Trump's victory is unquestionably a success for Russia, or to Russia's benefit at least. Ukraine's other Western allies are showing signs of uncertainty, of domestic weakness, of lack of resolve. So most major indicators are in Russia's favor at this point. There's no real reason for them to rush to the negotiation table. They may well wish to show, in terms of Trump's proposals, that they're ready to discuss them because they want to seem open. But I'm not sure that in reality they are actually looking for a way out. I think, on the contrary, they're quite confident that they're going to win.
Right, and when it comes to Trump and his questioning of the extent of U.S. military aid to Ukraine, do you think that's going to have a ripple effect in NATO's broader strategy, as if Trump decided to pull out some of the U.S. support, increasing the strain for other NATO allies? Do you think that's going to increase pressure on this NATO allies?
Yes, absolutely. The first question is practical. Can other NATO countries, can European countries compensate for the loss of American military aid? The short answer is no, not fully. They can certainly increase aid. You know, countries like Germany can produce a lot more. The French can produce more. Britain can produce more. Poland is already working hard to produce more. The Scandinavian countries, the Baltic countries. So I think there is room to increase what Europe is already giving. Europe is already engaged very heavily in Ukraine's support. They can do more, but they can't realistically replace what the Americans are providing. Some of the materials they simply don't have. Some of the materials, some of the weapon systems, some of the equipment they don't have, or they can't produce, or they can't produce in enough quantities. Artillery shells, for example. But then we also have the geopolitical factor to consider here. If America steps out of this alliance, if America takes a step back and says we're not going to be participating anymore, then all of a sudden a lot of European countries are going to get a lot more nervous about what they're risking. As long as America's involved, the entire West essentially is involved, and it makes it far more difficult for Russia to strike back against any individual countries. If America's outside of the equation, if it's just a coalition being led by a number of European countries, for example, the British, the Germans, the French, the Swedish, perhaps the Dutch, then those countries could be much more realistically targeted, let's say, by the Russians as a form of revenge or retribution or payback. That would certainly make them much more wary. So I think practically they'll find it difficult to replace America. And in terms of the politics involved, America stepping out would have a very chilling effect on this coalition and would cause a lot of people to say, hold on, maybe we need to consider our position as well here. It's not clear that it's going to be in our interest to pursue this with such resolve.
Right, so we'll still have to see how the situation develops. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us on TVP World. And thank you for watching this edition of World News Tonight. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.